Okay, so a lot of people who are planning on competing for the first time often wonder how different is training on prep as opposed to training in the off-season, and how different should it be? Now, there's a really short and simple answer to this, and then there's a lot of context I can provide as well. Now, the simple and short answer really is that in the beginning of prep, your training shouldn't look much different. And specifically as an athlete and as a client, you should maintain throughout the entirety of prep pretty similar levels of intent to progress and to apply yourself to an appropriate level of intensity. We should be training intensely and we should be trying to progress where possible. Now, from the coach's perspective or the program design perspective, essentially in the beginning of prep, then things like your training volume, so the amount of workload you're doing per session and across the week, will be pretty much exactly the same. Your exercise selection arguably can remain the exact same as well. These variables don't really need to change in the early stages. The consideration does change a little bit as you move through prep and you accumulate more and more fatigue, and that can also mean that your injury risk goes up, and then your ability to maintain appropriate levels of training intensity can start to be challenged when you're super tired. So as you move throughout prep, then your training can be manipulated in the areas of training volume. So say, for example, an individual gets more and more tired as they move through prep and they get more and more lean, then their ability to maintain proper levels of training intensity, we want to protect that, and their ability to do that goes down because of the fatigue. So therefore, one of the variables we can manipulate, as I said, would be training volume, where essentially you just get them to do a little bit less per session, and psychologically it's just much easier for the individual to maintain appropriate levels of intensity. Now also, the less volume you do, then the less fatigue you are causing from training as well. So if we also want to maintain a good level of intent to progress, then fatigue can be a killer to that as well. So tapering down volume can also allow an individual to potentially progress very slightly in terms of strength, although towards the deep end of prep that pretty much drops off regardless. But certainly for the first 60 to 70%, I would actually encourage people to try and think about getting a little bit stronger. Now maybe manage your expectations, and you wouldn't expect to get stronger to the rate that you usually would in the off season, but certainly we can absolutely maintain an intent to try and get a little bit stronger, even if it's just a couple of kilograms or a couple of extra reps here or there for the first, as I said, 60 to 70%. So sometimes tapering down volume can help an individual progress a little bit, especially in the early stages, maintain an appropriate level of intensity, and then also psychologically have a bit of an easier time as well. Now, I also mentioned exercise selection and your risk of injury, because as someone gets more and more lean and more tired, then their risk of injury does just increase. Because people are tired, they might misgroove an exercise in terms of its technique, or they might just not have the stability or the grounding strength that they usually have. Call it what you want. People's injury risk just does typically go up when they're on prep. Now, this is also probably further perpetuated by people who are enhanced and they're running anabolics that are sort of drying agents that can also cause potential issues. So basically, what I'm getting at is also to manage these variables and make sure an individual doesn't get hurt, you can also change their exercise selection. Whereas in the beginning of prep, or certainly in the off season, you might want them for whatever reason to rely more on dumbbells and barbells and things of that nature. Whereas you move through prep and they get lean and they accumulate more and more fatigue, you might want to stick to mostly machines. You might want to stick to mostly things that provide external stability to potentially reduce the risk of injury, and also increase an individual's confidence of control and things of that nature. So really, the things that we could manipulate as prep does start to progress and someone does start to get tired and lean is volume selection and exercise selection. But the entire time, I would absolutely encourage you to maintain the same level of intent to progress. Now, I did also mention that in the beginning, or say for example, the first 60 to 70% of your prep, your training should be mildly progressive in the slightest, okay? So you should actually see small progressions. Now, this does naturally drop off, as I kind of implied, after the first 60 to 70% of your prep is done, the deep waters, shall we say. You will notice a drop off in strength. Some body parts, it happens more than others. Some people, it happens more than others. And then it also depends on the nature of your prep. If you've gone for a really aggressive, fast-paced prep, you might notice a decline a little bit quicker because you're accumulating fatigue faster. Whereas somebody with a smaller calorie deficit who's getting leaner over a longer period of time, or maybe they just started prep in a little bit of a lean position anyway, this person typically holds on to strength a little bit better. There's not a sudden crash. But regardless, there's usually a drop off in strength towards the end. We are essentially trying our best to fight against that. We need to also accept the fact that it will happen. We will notice a drop off in strength eventually, but if we can do our best to manage our training and train intelligently and try and progress where possible, then it means that we might minimize essentially the natural damage that gets caused. So yes, expect a drop off in strength towards the deep end of your prep, and especially depending on the muscle group. Say for example legs and back and your big muscle groups that generally exercises can be programmed quite well and quite stable. These muscle groups typically hold on to strength a little bit better, but things like shoulders and arms, you'll notice a drop off a little bit faster. That's not true for everybody, but typically that's what I've found historically with my clients. So that's in terms of your strength. Now, one of the biggest things that we should probably talk about is the way that you're going to feel throughout training when it comes to prep. And throughout prep, you've got less food coming in. So this means you've got worse recovery than usual. So you will, at least in the beginning, notice more muscle soreness for a little bit longer. You will notice less pumps in the gym. You will notice that you have less fullness. In fact, that's just a natural part of prep. But specifically what I'm going to refer to, because all of that can happen even in a mini cut, so that's not too serious. But all of these next things I'm going to describe, these are a little bit more specifically pertains to like a prep scenario. So as you move deeper into a prep and get super lean, then your efficacy towards training, meaning just your confidence and your belief that you can do a good job, even that can start to massively decline. And oftentimes, as people who are very advanced and very experienced in the gym, the last few weeks of prep are, I don't want to say a write-off, but sometimes it's just better to leave your logbook at home because strength is declining, but also the way you feel during your sessions can often be pretty tough to deal with as well. Sometimes going into a set, even just the idea of the physical challenge of going into a set can be very difficult to muster up the enthusiasm to do essentially. Because you're so lean, energy's so low, your mood can fluctuate so massively that your desire to undergo physical stress, that can drop off massively as well. So deeper into prep, training can often become a very big psychological challenge, whereas usually in the off season, you love training. You're excited by training. Whereas deep into the back end of prep, it's just something you need to do. And it's difficult and you're not excited for your sets. And every single set, you're really having to hype yourself up and talk yourself into performing, let alone to a good standard, that it's essentially just cruising and doing what you can until the end of prep and holding on to as much muscle tissue as possible. But oftentimes, yes, you're fighting against your physiology and potentially the decline in strength and all of those things, but for the last few weeks of prep, you're really fighting against your own desire or lack of to train, and especially to train with an appropriate intensity. Really, that's one of the major reasons that you'll always hear people say that bodybuilding is just as much of a mental game as it is a physical game. Because a lot of these times you can do a good job, or relatively speaking, but mustering up the enthusiasm and, I don't want to say energy because that's few and far between when it comes to the last few weeks of prep, but essentially just mustering up the enthusiasm and the energy to do a good job, that is largely a psychological battle that's just good to be prepared for. And lastly, an extension to that, what I typically find on my own preps and a lot of the people that I coach and a lot of people I speak to, when it comes to training towards the back end of prep, especially the last few weeks, you might notice, especially if you're maintaining an appropriate level of intensity, your ability, regardless of whether you want to or not, your ability to tolerate volume goes down quite massively as well. Whereas in the beginning of prep, I'll quite happily do a leg session with 6 exercises. We're about 3 sets, 3 heavy, intense, close to failure sets, no problem at all, and enjoy the whole thing. When it comes to the back end of prep, I'll struggle with 4. Oftentimes I have to reduce my working sets to just 2. And training, number 1, to an appropriate level of intensity requires a psychological challenge that's its own challenge in itself, trying to muster up, as I said, the enthusiasm and the energy to actually do a good job. But then also the physiological response from my body, I notice my body's ability to tolerate volume drops off quite significantly as well. So All these things form largely what the challenges are, specifically in the deep end of prep. So we can essentially encapsulate all these different considerations and pretty much say with the first 60 to 70% of your prep, we should probably be getting a bit stronger, maintaining good training intensity. Volume is pretty similar, or at least it can be. Weight selection, or exercise selection rather, that can remain pretty much the same, although you might want to opt for safer use exercises and more machines. But as your energy starts to decline, it's important to just communicate with your coach and make sure that your coach has plans in order to help you with these variables as well, in order to manipulate your training, that as you accumulate fatigue, as you get leaner and leaner, we can start to change things in your training to make your ability to tolerate, both physically and psychologically, your ability to tolerate said training and still maintain an appropriate level of intensity and essentially do your best to maintain as much muscle tissue as possible, your ability should hopefully go up. So for the first little while, things are not too bad. Towards the back end of prep, things get hard, and it's important to have protocols and just understand the things that you can manipulate and the things you shouldn't be manipulating, and then also just be ready for the psychological challenge of when fatigue is super high and you're really lean, because that's a thing in itself. So hopefully this gives you some insight. I don't want to make things sound too scary. As I said really in the beginning, it's really not too bad, but it's always good to be prepared for the worst, and then if things turn out well in your favor, then it's a bonus. So that's it. All of my thoughts on training on prep. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, drop them in the message box and I'll chat to you in a bit.